Good evening, everybody. It is Craig, Whispering Storyteller here. I hope you are well. So tonight, we are going to settle down and I am going to tell you a really spooky ghost story. Just to settle down and make sure you're nice and relaxed. And you don't have to concentrate on anything I tell you. It's just a story, a bedtime story just for you. I'm going to tell you all about the haunting of Luibeilt Bothy. Okay, so these are articles that I found on the internet, and I'm just going to tell you the story of a haunting that took place in the extreme rural area in the Scottish Highlands. And it is told from the perspective of one person who spent the night in a ramshackle cottage. So, let's go for this story. So for anyone who doesn't know what a bothy is, it is a small abode which is open to use for labourers and walkers in the vicinity that might need shelter. They are free to use, but are often very basic and don't have all of the mod cons that you would get for paid accommodation. So, staying at a bothy often means that you've got to sleep on a wooden stone floor, a wooden or stone floor, say, and the toilets are usually just holes in the ground outside. Very, very basic, but it is a roof over your head and protects you from the elements. So these are dotted around the Scottish Highlands and again very free to use for anybody who might need somewhere to stay for the night. So like I said, they are in the middle of nowhere, which makes them a perfect place for ramblers, walkers or fell runners to set up camp. So this particular place is called Luibeilt Bothy, and it was built in the 1800s. And today it is a pile of rocks. It's a ruin which has fallen subject to adverse weather conditions, and I'll put a photograph in this area here, so you probably notice I'm sitting slightly off centre. That is because I want to use this area here for photographs to tell the story, or any pictures that I've got or found of the internet that I can use. So as you can see, that is Luibeilt now. But back in the day, it was a converted deer lodge. The bothy had been used on and off for years by people living off the beaten track, mountaineers and hikers. So although it was over 50 years ago, I'm going to take you back to where this story takes place, just after the Christmas period of 1973. And two guys, Phil McNeill and Jimmy Dunn, went off to the Scottish Highlands to do some hiking. So after doing some hitchhiking, they found themselves in the dead, rural area of the Scottish Highlands, where they didn't see a single soul for hours and hours and hours and hours. And they walked for 10 miles, and then in the distance, a stone building appeared in front of them that got closer and closer. Now, luckily for them, that place was a bothy, which meant they could stay there for the night before they moved on the next morning. So when they arrived at Luibeilt, they looked through the windows and they saw lots of dirty dishes in the sink, which was strange because the house was actually locked up quite tightly. What was particularly eerie about this was they hadn't seen a soul. It was during the Christmas period, and it was just very odd because usually a bothy would be open to anybody to go and stay for the night. It was such a long, hard walk to get there as well. A lot of it was uphill and quite treacherous. And it was quite difficult to get there because of the adverse weather. There was a lot of snow at that point. They also noted that because of the snow, they would have been able to see if anyone had arrived recently. But there was no footprints coming in or going from the cottage in any direction. So, unfazed by it all, they decided they would go for a day of climbing, then come back to Luibeilt to sleep later that night. So, a few hours later, they returned after their strenuous activities just before 9 p.m, so it would have been pitch black at that point and eerily quiet. They said it was freezing cold, but when they arrived back at the cottage, the windows of the bothy were nothing more than black holes, devoid of life. They shone the torches inside and were surprised to see the dirty dishes were still in the sink. And it was very, very cold on the mountain, and they needed somewhere to stay. So they found an old boarded up window and slipped inside Luibeilt. Now, the first thing that the two climbers noticed was the freezing temperature. So remember, like I said, this was in the deepest, darkest winter, but the air inside the bothy was colder inside than it was outside. And there was a strange stillness hit them, and they knew that, without doubt, they were completely alone. So they found and lit some candles, and they were surprised to see that a table had been set up for Christmas dinner, with crackers sitting around unpulled. So they had a very unnerving feeling that the people who had laid the table had left in a hurry. Very strange. So this almost must have felt like the Mary Celeste. So they decided to investigate the cottage. So they explored and discovered that all the rooms were fully furnished and the house had appeared to be occupied recently. But the occupants' whereabouts were unknown. So the two young men searched every room, but the cottage was completely deserted. Now the only room without any furnishings was the bedroom directly above the living room. Now the room was strange. It had a very small metal bed frame which had been dismantled, and on the windowsill there was a small boulder, a round boulder, and a pair of dirty olive green curtains hung open at the window. Well, given how cold it was, Phil and Jimmy decided to sleep downstairs in the living room in their sleeping bags. So they figured this would be less shocking for the current inhabitants if they were returned and found them sleeping there. Because they couldn't really get a huge shock, because after all it is a bothy and it is open to anybody wanting to stay there. So even though, given the time of day and the snow, it seemed unlikely that anyone would return to Luibeilt before daylight, treacherous weather in the middle of nowhere, and a very, very mountainous, uneven ground as well to be walking at night, never mind in winter. So, I think they played cards by candlelight, and at one point they decided that they were going to go to bed. So the candles were blown out and the blackness was complete. And Phil said you could not see your hand in front of your face. It was that dark, and the silence was absolutely thick because they were just miles away from anywhere. But immediately, clear as anything, they heard footsteps walking across the room directly above them. This was the room which was unfurnished, if you remember. So the steps were described as being those of somebody wearing hard-soled boots. Then they heard the metal bed frame being shifted around. And after that, there was a heavy grating noise. It sounded like the large stone being rolled around the wooden floor above them. Now, I would have been really creeped out by that, to think this all happened when they blew out the candles. But the men drifted off to sleep. They'd been climbing all day and they were exhausted, but they were woken at 4 a.m. with an eruption of sound in the room with them, and they could hear things being thrown across the room with great force, including their pickaxes. So as Phil fumbled in the dark for a candle, the noise died down. But the minute he lit the candle, it was dashed out of his hand and went flying across the room. The next sound was footsteps on the spiral staircase near the living room door. So he heard the steps coming down the spiral staircase, getting louder and louder, and he picked up his ice axe and went to open the living door, which would have met the foot of the spiral staircase. And just as the footsteps were reaching the bottom of the staircase, he flung open the door held up his ice axe, but there was nobody there. They were alone as far as they could see. The men hurriedly packed up their things and escaped out of the window. Shining their head torches from outside, they were shocked to look up to see that the olive green curtains were actually closed. Now they'd been open before. Well, afterwards, recounting this terrifying tale, the men said that there was no way anybody else was in that property. So haunted by his experience, plagued by nightmares, in the early 70s there wasn't much support for anyone with any mental illness. In order to come to terms with it, he decided to go back. And when he arrived in the mid-70s, he saw that fresh writing was on the walls and ceiling, saying, "Do not stay in this house. And this house is haunted. This house is evil." And he went back yet again, time after this, obsessed with that original experience. But each time he felt the same evil presence. Now, after doing some digging, Phil found an article in the Aberdeen Weekly News dated 1890, and it documented the suicide of John McAlpine, who had been a 40-year-old gamekeeper who had lived in Luibeilt. And the article stated that McAlpine had been in usual health in the morning, but was found hanging from a beam in the barn by his wife. Now, having done some research by using Google, it looks like we are unable to unearth any archives of the Aberdeen Weekly News to corroborate this. Now, the only thing that has been found is a snippet, which is apparently from the Northern Chronicle, and this was shared by a Gavin Jamieson on Twitter. That looks as though there was a suicide in Luibeilt in 1890. Now, Phil McNeill, the guy who was the victim in all of this, also is reported to have had a difficult relationship with his father growing up. It was a relationship that upset him greatly in many ways, and it wouldn't be uncommon for Phil's father to go months, sometimes years, without speaking or acknowledging Phil. And there is no more difficult time than an already strained parent-child relationship than those teenage years. So when you're on the cusp of adulthood, so Phil was in emotional turmoil, which, was one of the reasons why he took time out in that period to go and visit Ben Nevis, and that's how he stayed at this ramshackle cottage. On his return, Phil says that whatever evil has been haunting Luibeilt Bothy had followed him home. Now, he had moved out of his parents' house into a property on Gibson Street, where strange things started to happen there as well. And he began to harbour the idea that something was down in the basement, and he was convinced that whatever he had experienced in Luibeilt Cottage, Bothy, had followed him home. So he was unable to sleep without the light on and no longer felt safe. Strange things had begun to happen in the house, which escalated the longer that he stayed. So finally, having had enough, Phil fled 39 Gibson Street and ran to his father's house. It was only time in his life he'd actually asked his father for help. Now, one thing I want to know. So this story, by the way, was covered in quite a lot of depth in Uncanny, the podcast Uncanny that I've mentioned on my other video. And it just inspired me to kind of revisit the story myself. But one thing that I've noticed is there's no kind of information regarding Jimmy Dunn, Phil's climbing partner. Did he have the same story as Phil? So Phil returned to Luibeilt one final time with the BBC for the Uncanny Podcast. And if you want to know more and hear the tale in Phil's own words, I would highly recommend listening to the Uncanny Podcast. So here I am, a few days later from the last recording I did, and I kind of couldn't finish off the video because I ended up having to do something, but I've been thinking about Luibeilt ever since. So really, having listened to the story itself, there's a few things in order for me to make up my mind if this is possibly a genuine, uncanny episode. So, was it true? Well, as I said earlier, the one thing that kind of bothers me is the lack of Jimmy Dunn's evidence. So Jimmy Dunn did not appear on Uncanny. He hasn't released a statement. I don't know if he's passed. It could even be that he's no longer with us. But I did notice that it didn't give reference to him. Now, having a second person's account of what happened might have just added a little bit more to this story, which is a superb, terrifying story. But the fact is, I am convinced that Phil McNeill has suffered greatly from this experience. It is something which has affected his mental health since it happened. So the question remains, on that original 1973 trip, could it have been that somebody was inside the bothy with the two guys? Could it be that somebody heard them coming in, watched them playing cards, settling down for the night, and then started playing tricks? Could that have happened? Now, the two guys were adamant that there was nobody else in the bothy with them, and I kind of do agree that they would have known, because this place was in the middle of nowhere. It was in the middle of the festive period. Nobody in their right mind would have been walking around the Scottish Highlands during Christmas alone in such a remote area. So the question does remain, was somebody else in there with them? I can't rule it out in my head because we only have Phil's story. If we'd had Jimmy's, it might might have just added a little bit more weight to the story. Now, one thing you might have known that I mentioned that he did return in 1975 to the very same place, Luibeilt. And I think this was something to try and exorcise the demons, if you like, because he was plagued by poltergeist activity in his home in Gibson Street. And it must have been a very, very unsettling experience travelling to Luibeilt again. I can understand why he did it. He just wanted to put himself back into that situation to try and confront the thing that was haunting his dreams. Now, he went with somebody, and the second time they got there, they did see the graffiti on the wall, which said, "Do not stay in this house. This house is haunted." Now, according to Phil, they once again settled down for the night, but the experience, the supernatural experience, was somewhat different. He reported that he did not hear anything from upstairs in the bedroom, but instead he heard some kind of dragging noise from outside. It was as if something was rustling, as if something was being dragged along the ground, and it got closer and closer to Luibeilt. I mean, he must have been terrified. But then the rustling sound was heard outside of the window where they were in this living room, once again staying in the same room as he did in 1973. But then he said he felt as if the rustling had entered the room where they were in. But then, I don't know if he put on the candle, but everything kind of reversed. He said that the noise just grew faint in the distance again, and then everything went quiet. Now again, we don't have anybody else's recollection for this story. Just Phil's. And yeah, he went back a third time, as I mentioned, and this was with Uncanny, the podcast. So Danny Robbins, who is the host of Uncanny, gave him some recording equipment, and he went to Luibeilt for a third time alone. And when he got there, he did say that it was a very foreboding atmosphere. Again, the silence, and Luibeilt by this stage had become very, very dilapidated, very ruined. The ceiling had gone, and the whole thing was now just a shell exposed to the elements. There were signs of where the fire used to be, and the layout of the rooms was still very visible in his head, but there was nothing else. And all he could report from this recording he made was that it still had that sinister, foreboding atmosphere, but there were no noises. And certainly the rooms were gone at this point. Actually, in the podcast, you do hear a weird sound, and I jumped out my skin when I heard it. But I don't know if it was just an animal or a cracking of a branch or something like that. But there you go. Is Luibeilt haunted? Well, if you just go on YouTube, there's lots of ramblers and YouTubers who have spent the night in Luibeilt and recorded it, and you can even spend the night with them. And they go wandering around by torchlight, and you can see all of the rooms, and ultimately nothing happens. So, if you were to search for Luibeilt now, you can watch a lot of these videos. You can hear the Uncanny Podcast, which I'll put in the link. But the fact remains, did it happen? The question remains, should I say. And again, I've got no doubt in my head that Phil McNeill believes it entirely. So there we go. I will leave you with the question. Maybe you could do some digging yourself. Put some comments in down below if you wanted to talk about it, if you had a decision or you had some thoughts of your own. It would be good to hear it. But in the meantime, I am going to say adieu and wish you